Hi everyone, it's Zed here. I just thought it's probably a good idea to take people through the basic setup of Logic and doing the preferences and perhaps coming up with a template or something. So I've basically just booted up. I've had to trash my preferences just to get it back to this beginning state. You can tell it's in GarageBand mode because it's got the wooden sides, and there's not many features available when you get it in this mode. It's pretty much just like GarageBand with some extra mixing sort of stuff. So what we want to do is let's go up to our Logic Pro preferences and we'll just go through them. So just by the way, just remember that the preferences are for Logic on this computer, so whatever you do on here will stick, whereas if you go into File, Project Settings, it's got like a whole bunch of other settings, but these are actually attached to a particular project. So they might change every time depending on what you're actually doing, whether it's a film soundtrack or a piece of music. So preferences are general, and we're going to go into the first tab, the general tab, and the first bit is I usually just kind of go, what do you want to do when Logic fires up? Personally, I find it a little bit annoying. The default seems to be open the most recent project. And that's fine if you don't do too many projects, or they're not huge. But sometimes if this setting is selected and you've just been doing this huge kind of film soundtrack project, it can take about 5 minutes for it to load up before you then have to shut it down because you just want to start something new. So I actually kind of prefer it to just ask before it does anything. You can also do things like how many backups do you want of your Logic project, and it basically is just like a queue. So once you've hit 10 backups, it'll kind of rotate around them. What else? You can also kind of, if you're doing a lot of writing and stuff, you might want more than the system default under the recent items list, and that's just up under Logic, File, Open Recent, and it'll just be kind of a whole bunch of things you've been working on. If you're doing a lot of stuff, you might want to bump that up a bit. So moving on, editing. Now there's a couple of things in here that might be worth changing. I kind of like not the default for this, which just seems to be opens a shortcut menu for the right mouse. So if I right click over here, you basically get a little contextual menu depending on what you click on. I mean, that's pretty good. The thing is though, you've got to remember with a Mac, going right back to the old school days, if you control click, you get that same menu. So back when Macs only had a single button mouse, the way you got the right mouse was just by control clicking. So that's always there if you touch the control key or the control button before you click the left mouse. So to me, that's a little bit pointless. Some people have assignable to a tool. So if I right click, I can assign this tool to it. I actually kind of prefer that, to be honest, and I'll show you why later on. You can also have it so it opens a tool menu, so right mouse, and you can see that these are all the different tools that I can now apply to my mouse button. So, I mean, that's kind of handy. It's all about how you want to work. I'm going to assign it to a tool because I tend to just use 2 or 3 tools all the time for pretty much everything. So, and that means I don't have to use menus and stuff like that, so it's a little bit faster. You can also say, by the way, just jumping back up to the top of this, you can set the number of undo steps. So I've got it set to 100. You can have more, you can have less. Just be a little bit aware though, the more of these you have, it's basically every time you do something in Logic, it creates an undo step. And so it can actually use a lot more memory in your computer as you're working on a Logic track. It also means that's why sometimes Logic starts getting a bit flaky and doing weird stuff. Sometimes just actually saving your project, closing it and then opening it again will flush out these undos, and then you're good to go again, and it's really responsive. So just keep an eye on that it's handy to have a lot of undo steps, but there is always a price to pay, What else can we do down here? I usually turn this on, so it says Pointer Tool in Tracks provides. That just means that when there's an audio region, you can automatically just click on either end and you get fades. So you don't have to go and get a fade tool and stuff. I'm not going to tick this one because I actually have my right mouse set to the marquee tool, so it's always there anyway. And quick swipe and editing, take editing click zones. I'll show you what that is later on, but it doesn't hurt to put that on. I also turn these on, and it's basically just saying when you start moving regions around, the direction that you start moving it in, it will lock to that direction. So if you're trying to move things along a line without it moving up and down, or vice versa, it's pretty easy. You can override it just by holding the shift key though. You can see if you actually hold the mouse over, you get the little pop-up that gives you some more information. So, okay, and also when you double click a MIDI region, what do you want it to open in? Piano roll, nice, okay. So just flicking through a few of these other ones quite quickly. A lot of the stuff is sort of cosmetic. I'll turn that on, I don't know why, doesn't seem to make much difference. I usually kind of turn all these catch things on as well. That just means the windows kind of link in with each other when you're doing stuff, and also it will update things like sustain pedal. It'll look back down the track to see if you've hit a sustain pedal when you start playing further along, and things like that. Notifications, this is just a big list of things that you've, dialogues that you've clicked, don't show me this again or whatever. You can reset them if you want to. Audio, we're going back up to this audio tab, and this is a really important one. So this one here is basically where you set what your input and output from Logic are. And by the way, it's independent from whatever you've got your computer set to. So if you're playing iTunes, this is only the Logic version of where that sound's coming from. So by default, I've got it set to universal audio. If I am doing something else, I might set these differently. So at the moment, if I want to play some sound through this that you guys can hear, I'd have to turn it onto this Telestream audio capture and apply the change. So yeah, click pop, it's doing its thing, and hopefully you can hear me again. This thing here is really important. The I/O buffer size is basically how much time you're giving the computer to process the audio between, like, for example, you playing your MIDI keyboard and you hearing the sound in your headphones or on the speakers. And so the secret is you want to keep this pretty low when you're first creating your song, because you want to keep that latency down quite short. But as time goes on, you'll start getting warning messages from Logic that says, hey, I can't keep up with this workload that you're giving me in such a short period of time. And so what you do is you increase this buffer size, and usually by the time you're mixing, you've got this up at about 1024, and it's fine. So keep it short. I'm used to just using 128. By the way, you can also see it tells you what that delay is. They call it latency, and it's basically, if you just hit, that's not too bad actually. If you go up to like 1024, you can see that it's like 132 milliseconds. If you hold the mouse over it, it works out to be the equivalent of like 45 meters away from your guitar amp if you were like playing a guitar sound. It's a pretty huge stage, if you're playing that far away. So keep it down around there. Some of this other stuff, never touch this recording delay unless there are particular issues that you're having with Logic and or your interface. That should always just be on 0. This is really just kind of the amount of cores and threads that your CPU is running. So I've got a 6-core, and it runs hyperthreading, so you can get 2 threads per core, so I can have up to 12. But I just leave it on automatic. It seems to work. You can say also the multi-threading, whether it's playback tracks only or playback and live tracks. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's a whole kind of topic in itself. Just try it on either and see if you have any problems. And I leave that on 64-bit because it's better than 32-bit. Cool. So moving on. So we're in audio devices. There's a couple of other settings under audio. So this is general. And obviously, yeah, this just displays a little overload message, which is quite handy when I know I need to increase my buffer, for example. Down here, you can sort of say how accurately do you want it to track the automation if you start doing automation. And it's sort of a trade-off. The more accurate it is, the more of a load it puts on your computer. But then, why wouldn't you want it as accurate as possible? Because you don't want any kind of delay between things being panned and volumes coming up and down. You can also hear it says automatic bus assignment users. This just means that when you dial up certain patches out of the library, sometimes they are using buses to create reverb sends and kind of submixes. So if you dial up a drum kit or an electronic drum kit, for example, it might be using a whole bunch of buses. So it's basically just, this is a way to reserve some of them. So if you have made your own template that's got various kind of reverb sends and returns or subgroups, you can say to Logic, don't use anything below 32. I'm going to use them for my own stuff. So you can click that. It just kind of stops any weirdness and problems happening. Software monitoring just means you can actually hear what you're recording. I turn this on and to put an independent monitoring level for record-enabled channel strips. That means when I arm a track for record, I can change the fader level, and then when I untick the record button, it will jump back to where it was. So it basically just means that you can have a monitor level for recording and a monitor level for playback, and they're independent. It just makes life a little bit easier if you have to turn yourself up a bit while you're recording. And down here, this is basically plugin latency. It's kind of complicated to explain, but every plugin and every instrument actually takes processing power, and it's like going back to this buffer that we were talking about. Every plugin needs its own buffer, and it needs to report to Logic what that should be. And so this is basically it automatically making up the time difference in all those. So it's good to have it on, but just be aware that if you turn it to all, you probably should avoid having a whole bunch of plugins on your stereo out while you're trying to record, because they can actually add in latency that will cause you problems. Low latency mode is just a way of like what happens, right? If I go back to here, what happens when you're down in 1024 samples and you now want to re-record a vocal? Well, it's a bit of a dilemma, because in the old days, what you'd have to do is you could put it back down to a lower buffer so that you didn't get that big delay. But if you did that, the song wouldn't play because you got too many plugins and instruments going. So what you would have to do is go and turn off a whole bunch of them just so that you could actually run that lower buffer so you could record in time. But what Logic does is it kind of cheats that, and it's got a low latency mode, and what it will do, it'll automatically disable a bunch of plugins that are using a lot of power temporarily, and then you can record, and then you turn that back off, and it goes back to where it was before. So it's kind of a quick way of temporarily bypassing that high buffer. It just comes up, you can put a button up here that does it, so you don't have to go into this menu and do it all the time. And also you shouldn't leave it on, otherwise it's just going to be turning off a bunch of plugins all the time. So anyway, moving on, we can sprint through some of the stuff. Editing, doesn't really matter. This is just the crossfades on automatic stuff. I/O assignments are basically the input and output assignments. You don't really have to worry about this too much. You can see it's really set up for bouncing off surround sound, soundtrack kind of project files, so you can assign different names for each one and stuff. The one thing that probably is kind of handy to know about in here is, and you can change, if you've got a audio interface that's got multiple outputs on it, you can say which one is the one that you want to send all your sound out of. And it won't do it at the moment, because if I go back into here, it's because I've selected this Telestream audio capture as my output. But if I go back temporarily to the Thunderbolt, just to show you, apply changes. Yeah, and then, yep, it's back. Sorry, my sound just vanished. Now if I go in here, these are all the different outputs that I can get from my audio interface. And so it could be that my speakers are listening to 3/4. But this here is a kind of handy thing to know about. If I click this little mirroring button, whichever one of these I set to my outputs, it's still going to go to 1 and 2 as well. So it's a quick way of kind of setting up. You might go, well, my headphone sends are on 3 and 4, and I turn mirroring on, and now my speakers and my headphone sends are all listening to the same thing. So it's just good to know that that actually exists, and it can mess you up if you don't, and you've somehow, tick something there. I'm just going to go back into my main thing again, and turn that back to Telestream. And we're back. So, yeah, so that's the only thing on the IO assignments. Audio file editor. Hey, by the way, this can be kind of handy because what I do, right, and I'm not going to get into this so much in this particular tutorial, but you can assign an external sample editor. And if, like me, I'm just going to go into my applications and I'll show you this. So if I go to Isotope, GHI, okay, just type this in, couldn't I? Isotope and RX7 audio editor. If you don't know what that is, it's a really good way of kind of declicking and getting noise out of recordings. So I'm just going to go choose. And this means now that there's some menus where if I'm editing files, I can just open it up automatically in this external editor, do my repairs, save it, and when I come back into Logic, it's actually updated it. So this is a really powerful little feature right there. MP3, you can just set your defaults. Doesn't really matter. I'd probably go at least, that. MP3s are terrible, anyway. Recording, a couple of things in here. So you can see, like, there wasn't, it's taken me a while to go through some of these menus, but in reality, there's only a couple of things that you would probably have to worry about. So if I go into recording, and I'm going to select Wave because it tends to be a little bit more universal and has a few more features than the AIF default that comes up. This is the Apple file format. This was originally the Windows one, but it's now everything. CAF is only really good for, well, not only really good, but its main feature is you can do really, really long recordings in it. It's almost like a movie file that's got files inside a container. So if you want to do like a 10-hour recording of like a radio show or something, CAF is the way to go. AIF and Wave will actually time out after about 4 hours, I think it is their maximum file limit. So that's basically what that's in there for. Leave that ticked. There's a few options down here. What I would say is, so this is basically just saying if you've got an overlapped recording, and this is the MIDI recording, this is the audio recording, what do you want to happen? And that defaults to merge, and it's the kind of the shittiest option, to be honest. You're better off like clicking take folder, or I'm starting to use this down here, create track alternative is actually kind of a cool way of doing it. So I'm going to go with that, same with that, avoid merge. Merge just means every time it goes around in a cycle and you're recording MIDI, it will just keep adding stuff and it just turns into a giant mess, as you can imagine. I'm going to leave the audio on take folders, and you can see, by the way, it's got little buttons here, so you can just go straight into the project settings to the same recording setting of that, but I'm not going to do that right at this moment. I'm going into the MIDI tab, and pretty much you can leave a lot of this stuff at its defaults. I usually turn this on. It just means you can send reset messages. If you finish recording and you haven't put your pitch bend back to the middle, it can be a real pain in the bum. And sync, it's got a few sync options. I'm not going to get into that too much right at the moment. The input, MIDI input section is basically what it sees as inputs, and it's kind of handy because it means you can turn off particular MIDI ports if they're going to cause problems. I won't go into it too much at the moment, but it's just good to see this is where your MIDI is coming from. So you might sort of, it's at the moment I've only got one controller plugged in, which is my Novation, and these are all the MIDI things that are actually showing up from that. So display, it's kind of handy. We'll quickly go through this. I would say the main things in here is turn on the default values here. So, and basically this is your little kind of parameter area. It's your inspector for regions, and if you click this show default values, you can see now this is where you click. Whereas if you don't, it's kind of like, oh well, how do I scroll? It's kind of hidden. It's a secret little place to click, and which is kind of dumb. Like they should actually have this on by default. And now I can see where I can actually click and drag up and down to change those settings. Show icons in the new tracks dialog. This is like if I go up to the track menu and go new tracks. This is this kind of fancy looking little window here, and it's not bad, it's easy to kind of figure out, and it's kind of like the simplest version of it, so that it's easy to kind of understand what you're doing. It distinguishes between, like, if you're using recording a vocal or recording a guitar or bass. If you're they're both audio inputs, but this one will put some guitar amps or bass amps in the signal chain, so it sounds okay. So the difference over here is if I turn off show icons, and I'll go back in again, track, new tracks. Now I get this slightly more boring version of it. However, it does have one feature that doesn't show up. This one is, I think they've assumed it's a more professional one because there's less graphics. But what you can do is you can create multiple tracks. So if you're trying to record a drum kit, I can type in 8 tracks here, and then I can also have it so if I click ascending, it means each track will have a different input, so that's ready to record the different microphones. So this it's just that one real cool feature in this particular view. So if you're doing that kind of professional recording and not just sort of one MIDI thing at a time, that's probably a good idea to go with that option. Otherwise, click the show icons one. And getting there. So all this stuff is pretty much just standard. There's a little bit of kind of cosmetic stuff in here. You can actually, this is a new one in this version, 10.4.7. Show track or bar number while scrolling, and it just basically means that when you're in this window, as you're scrolling backwards and forwards, it'll come up with a little number in the middle. It's quite handy when you've got like 100 tracks, for example, and you're not sure which one you're scrolling down to. You can have shaded loops, so a lot of this stuff is just kind of cosmetic. And you can leave all this. This is mixer stuff. Just leave it on the generic defaults. And this here is basically just, do you want your piano roll to have a bright background, sort of like Logic 9 used to have back in the day. So if I just go into piano roll, yeah, bright background or the dark background. And I'm not going to go too much into score stuff. There's a few settings in the preferences, but mostly it's actually set in the project settings. There's a little bit about importing movies. Do you want to use the Logic Pro audio output when you bring the movie in? There's a whole bunch of options that actually comes up when you actually import your movie, about what to do with the sound and all that kind of stuff. Automation is basically just when you move a region that's got some automation on it. I pretty much always move that automation with the region. It seems to be the most logical thing. Also make sure that these are ticked, but don't tick solo, whatever you do, otherwise problems will ensue later on. And just a quick thing about control surfaces. Most of this is like way too deep for what we want to get into. But if you go to the MIDI controllers tab, you can see which keyboards are being recognized. And when you first actually turn on your keyboard with Logic, it will come up with a little thing that says, do you want to use this as a MIDI control surface? And it's like, oh, I would say no, select no, and that's why this is unticked. So if you tick this, now it's going to use whatever default assignments that the manufacturer has decided will work well with Logic, and it may not work for you, and it can really freak you out if you don't know what's going on. You might accidentally bump a button or twiddle a knob on your keyboard, and all sorts of mayhem can ensue. So I'd say unless you really know what you're doing or have read the instruction manual, just untick that and say no when it shows up in the first place. You can put in your info here. The playlist is for when you bounce to iTunes, which playlist you want to put it into. And then we're kind of back to the advanced section again. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a heads up. We'll go into some of the kind of the more detailed versions of how some of those are going to be influenced on the actual Logic project itself. Anyway, that's all for now. Back soon with the details.